All right, gentle listeners, back again with Michael Lofton, who has been on this show, I don't know, 2-3 times. I've been on your show a handful of times. We always have a ton of fun. In fact, I was recently on your show talking about my new book, and now you're on my show talking about your new book. This is called The Law of Reciprocity, my friends. But but like, jokes aside, like I really do love what you're doing. I love your work, so I'm excited to talk about it anyways. And I have to admit, Michael, you know, the whole Catholic, Orthodox debate is just it's not anywhere, my area of expertise. I think it's utterly fascinating. I've kind of come in where there's certain, philosophical disputes, the whole divine simplicity, essence, energies, stuff like that has fascinated me. But beyond that, I am but a humble student here to learn. And I think this will be a cool episode. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, please announce your new book. What is it? It's already out. So I want to make sure we bring attention to that. And what can people expect to find, in its pages?
Yeah. And once again, thanks for having me on, Pat. It's always an honor. Yeah. So the book is called Answering Orthodoxy. It's available right now at shop.catholic.com. And in fact, if you go there and you type in the promo code Orthodoxy, you'll get a discount on it. So what this book is doing is ultimately I am showing Catholics who are considering leaving the Catholic Church for Eastern Orthodoxy. I'm showing them that the arguments they're generally going to hear from the Eastern Orthodox about Catholicism are false. So the arguments are not usually good arguments. They're inaccurate. And in fact, often the very thing that the Orthodox are objecting to is actually something found in their own Eastern tradition. Like, for example, the papacy and the papal claims. I deal a lot with the papal claims and objections related to those in the book. And I show ultimately these aren't good arguments, but not only that, but ultimately what an Orthodox is objecting to, it's already found in their tradition. And so there's no point of contention here ultimately, or at least there shouldn't be. So the main focus is to show Catholics that there isn't any good reason to leave Catholic communion for Eastern Orthodoxy. And of course, it's also going to help Eastern Orthodox understand that their objections to the Catholic Church aren't legitimate, and there's no reason to continue to object to the Catholic claims. And I also think that it would be helpful even for a Protestant who's considering Catholicism or Orthodoxy. They don't know which way to go. I think this will help them work through those issues.
Okay, very cool. So would you say this is more of a defensive book then? And by that, I mean, and these books are really helpful, I think, as something like Tim Paul's work on, Christology. He's not like, hey, I'm not going to prove to you that all this is true, but I'm going to show you that all the arguments against it, they're not any good, right? So you have no reason to abandon it. And that itself could be a really helpful type of project, right? Is that sort of what your book is up to?
That's accurate. So this wouldn't be a book that I would the primary audience wouldn't be somebody like who's an atheist who wants to consider Catholicism. If I were to try to prove the papal claims to maybe an atheist, I would have to start
more
foundational questions. But what I'm doing here is for people who are already Catholic, I say, look, here's what the Orthodox are saying, and here's what they're objecting to, but the very thing they're objecting to is found in their own tradition. So why leave Catholicism and go to Eastern Orthodoxy when the thing they're objecting to is found in their own tradition? It makes no sense. It's not a legitimate reason to jump ship. Perhaps maybe one is frustrated with the crisis in the Catholic Church, liturgical, theological, whatever they're experiencing. Perhaps they're dissatisfied and they're looking for greener pastures, and they think that they're going to find that in Eastern Orthodoxy. I'm writing to those Catholics and saying, hold on, wait. If you look at the Eastern tradition, they're already accepting the papal claims, for instance. So if you ultimately want to be faithful to the first millennium, you need to be a Catholic. And so jumping ship is not going to be helpful.
Yeah, so that's interesting. Is it sort of like this? Is the strategy generally something like, hey, if you're going to make this objection, if it proves anything, it's going to prove too much, right? So either you should abandon the objection or you should abandon Catholicism and Orthodoxy.
Let me give you an example of that.
Yeah, let's do it.
That exact thing there. In fact, the very first objection that I deal with is Jesus is the head of the church, not the Pope. And I want to show that actually this proves too much, this argument. Because if you say, well, Jesus is the head of the church, not the Pope, somehow those two can't be true, then ultimately Orthodox are working against their own ecclesiology and their own views because they believe the bishop is head of the local church. Now, obviously, Jesus is also the head of the local church, right? So, if we're going to use this argument on the universal level and say the Pope can't be the head of the church because Jesus is the head of the church, well, you would have to be consistent and make that same argument on the local level and say that even the bishop can't be the head of the church on the local level because Jesus is the head. And this also, again, proves too much even in the household, where scripture talks about how the husband is head of the wife. Well, wait, I thought that Jesus is the head of all humans, including wives. But obviously, the headship of the husband over the wife is not antithetical to the headship of Jesus over all humans, including wives. Likewise, the local bishop and his headship is not opposed to Jesus's headship on the local level. And thus, it's also true on the universal level. The Pope being the head of the church in the Catholic tradition is not opposed to Jesus also being the head of the church. We make a distinction between a visible head versus invisible head. And so in the same way we would afford that distinction on the local level or even domestic level, we need to apply that to the universal level. So ultimately, I think the objection proves too much. And then I point out things like, well, look, even the ecumenical councils that Eastern Orthodox accept, 3 ecumenical councils, speak of the Pope as the head of the churches.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's get in. Yeah. No, that's exactly what I want to get into, because this is the papacy. Sometimes people say this is the most important, Catholic claim. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I probably veer towards it isn't, but other people say it's the most distinctive. And in a sense, that's right. So a lot of the debate, centers around these papal claims. So if you wouldn't mind, actually, the one thing that I always liked about, Catholicism before I, came into the church and was confirmed and all that, is that it actually makes, very strong claims, right? And certain predictions that seem quite open to falsification, right? And like for whatever, and now I don't think falsification is the end all be all for, accepting some position is rational, whether it's open to falsification or not. But there is something kind of nifty about having that be an option on the table, right? Because you can kind of just okay, the church predicts X. In the history of the Catholic Church, do I see clearly not X? Now, of course, some people are going to say, yes, you do. See, it predicts X. We see not X. We have this sort of falsification event. And a lot of these debates center around these papal claims. So help us to understand what do you think are these central papal claims that certainly Catholics are committed to, but also are the claims that you will hear objections to from Orthodox that you say, well, hold on a minute, because you guys actually you're committed to these as well. Help us, set all that up for us.
Yeah. So I think you're spot on that it's ultimately the papal claims that is kind of the deal breaker here, and so everything really hinges on that. As far as what we're saying as Catholics, there's a number of claims that we make about the papacy, but you can boil them down to 2 fundamentally, and that is papal authority, specifically papal supremacy, and then papal infallibility. The first doesn't say that, hey, the Pope just gets to do whatever he wants. He can teach whatever he wants. No, he has to be in line with the deposit of faith, that which is revealed by God. The magisterium is not above the word of God. So obviously there's limits to this. So when we speak of the Pope as exercising supremacy, it doesn't just mean that he's an absolute dictator and can just do whatever he wants. No, obviously there's some boundaries here. But what we mean by papal primacy, some people call it supremacy, is the claim that the Pope does have the authority to interfere in the affairs of any bishop, even without their consent. So Orthodox are generally going to say that no, the Pope does not have the authority to interfere in the affairs of a local bishop. especially without their consent. They might agree, well, maybe he can interfere if the bishop consents to it, but not if he doesn't consent to it. Whereas the Catholic Church is going to say, no, he has immediate authority, even in that territory. So if he thinks that the bishop is doing something wrong, he can interfere. So the Pope could, for instance, determine whether or not somebody is going to be ordained in that diocese, right? Even without the consent of the local bishop. And many Orthodox are just going to push back on that. They're just going to say, no, 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 no. It's the local bishop who has autonomy. You can't interfere in the affairs of the church. So that's one claim. The other claim is papal infallibility. And what we're saying is that the teaching authority of the Bishop of Rome is indefectible. And specifically when we talk about infallibility, we generally are referring to what's called ex cathedra teachings. This is how Vatican I puts it. Whenever the Pope is teaching solemnly from the authority of St. Peter on a matter of faith and morals, that which he teaches is free from all error. So it has to be limited to faith and morals. He has to be teaching the universal church, and he has to be doing so as this universal shepherd, not as a private theologian. And when we say those three conditions are met, then yes, what he teaches is free from error. Generally, Orthodox are going to say, no, we don't agree with that. We don't believe that he has that kind of authority. The difficulty, however, here is that if we look at the ecumenical councils, I argue that the concepts of papal supremacy and the concepts of papal infallibility are found substantially, perhaps in seed form, but substantially in the councils that Eastern Orthodox already accept as authoritative. So if one is going to be consistent and hold to the ecclesiology of the fathers of these ecumenical councils, they have to embrace the papal claims. But if you embrace the papal claims, you've conceded the Catholic position. But if you're then rejecting the papal claims, you're rejecting the Catholic position, but I think you're going against that which the council fathers in the first millennium taught. And that's where the difficulty is. I feel like at that point, it's a death blow to the Orthodox if they're rejecting the papal claims, because it's found in their own ecumenical councils.
Yeah. Okay, great. Let's some examples, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, I think the most interesting example comes, in my opinion, comes from Pope Agatho's letter to the emperor at the Sixth Ecumenical Council. And this is interesting for a couple of reasons, because this is the same council that condemned Pope Honorius.
Which we'll get to in a minute.
Which
that's
we'll
one
get
of those,
to in a minute.
Alleged falsification events, right? Yeah.
But that's also a lot of times why this is overlooked. Because when we think of the Sixth Ecumenical Council, we think of their condemnation of Pope Honorius. And so it's often overlooked what they actually were conceding about the papal claims in sessions prior to that. So what Pope Agatho does is he writes a letter to the emperor. And in this letter, he is explicitly teaching the indefectibility of the teaching authority of the Bishop of Rome. And he's rooting it not in canons of various councils. He's rooting that indefectibility in the promise of Jesus, when Jesus promised to Peter that his faith would not fail. And then Agatho applies that to the successors of Peter, specifically in the bishops of Rome. And what's interesting here is this view that the Pope puts forward in this letter to the emperor is then read out loud at the Sixth Ecumenical Council. Now, how did the fathers react? Did they cry out heresy? This is not in agreement with our ecclesiology. No, in fact, they write a letter back, the council fathers, and they accept Agatho's letter. They agree with it. They say it's divinely inspired. They even cite his Petrine authority to back it up. So in other words, they are accepting his claims about the indefectibility of the Pope and his teaching authority. What's even more interesting is Pope Agatho in this letter says all of his predecessors were unblemished. That would include Honorius.
Yeah, yeah.
Even more interestingly,
So like either these guys were really dumb or there's more nuance to the situation.
there's got to be some nuance. Yeah,
Right?
I don't think they're really dumb, right? So there's got to be some
You're
nuance
like
here.
major short-term memory loss or something going
Yeah,
on, right?
yeah, and some people might suggest that, but I don't buy that. But even
Yeah.
more interestingly, he also speaks of this indefectibility, not just up until his time, that is Pope Agatho, but he says that it will be undefiled unto the end because of this divine promise of Jesus. In other words, you can never have a case where the Bishop of Rome would teach heresy. So his teaching authority will always be free from error, and he won't defect from the faith, which is, I think, problematic for the Orthodox because they currently hold that the Pope is in heresy by
Of
teaching
course.
the Filioque. So I
Yeah.
want to say that's actually inconsistent with what they're embracing, the ecclesiology that their own council fathers are embracing here in this particular case. Now, how does that work with Pope Agatho? I am happy to discuss that too.
Mhm. Okay, well, I mean, on the face of it, that seems like quite a strong case. Obviously, there's a response, right,
Mhm,
from the Orthodox side. What do you think
mhm,
is the best response that you've heard to
mhm.
the argument that you've just put out, and what is your response to that response?
Mhm. You know, the best response tends to be that, okay, well, the council fathers said this, but then you have to look at the way they behaved. So they might have agreed with it on paper, but then do they actually act like that in reality? That the Pope has this kind of teaching
They were
authority.
just being kind of polite or something
And
like that.
and yeah, and I think that's not helpful for the Orthodox, because that would then mean that the fathers were disingenuous, because it would then mean that they're embracing heresy for the sake of being political and keeping good relations with Rome, but they didn't actually believe it. That would attribute dishonesty to the fathers. So I actually don't think that that's helpful, because if they're now dishonest in the ecclesiology that they embrace, what is to stop us from saying they're also dishonest in their evaluation of Christology, right? Why would
Sure.
I accept their Christology when they seem to compromise on questions related to ecclesiology?
Yeah.
So I
So
don't find that very helpful.
it would sort of invite a much wider and more pernicious skepticism, it seems.
Yeah, and if people are acting inconsistent with their profession, okay, that doesn't take away from their profession. It just means
Mhm.
that they're hypocritical, which still also would not help the case of the Orthodox, because if we're saying that the Council Fathers were hypocritical, are these really people that we want to point to as, you know, solid figures in their Christology? I don't know. So it doesn't seem to help the Orthodox position. So I haven't found that to be sufficient. Some
Yeah.
others will say, well, look, that couldn't be what they meant, because they then condemn Pope Honorius. Or others say, well, they reversed that and they backtracked that acceptance of what Pope Agatho said. And they backtracked it and reversed it because of their condemnation of Honorius, which I don't think any of those are convincing either.
Mhm. Okay, well, should we go to Honorius then? Is that the next best place to
Probably, because that's the most conspicuous question that we really have to address here, because that's what everybody's going to think is like, okay, well, if they accepted the indefectibility of the teaching authority of the church of the Bishop of Rome,
Mhm.
why do they condemn Honorius as a heretic?
Yeah, yeah,
um,
yeah, so give us the
yeah,
necessary, background there, and then let's get into it. Mhm.
yeah, and so it is true that they do condemn him as a heretic, and some will try to soften that and say that it's a condemnation merely of negligence, because Pope Leo, who does ratify this council later on, Pope Leo II, I believe, he does speak about negligence in the case of Pope Honorius, but it's rightly pointed out that, well, they're also specifically calling him a heretic, and saying that he shared in the impiety of those who taught heresy. So maybe it's a little bit more than just mere negligence.
Sure.
I'm willing to concede that. But how do we deal with this now? Because in one session, they're accepting the indefectibility of the teaching authority of the Bishop of Rome and all of the predecessors of Agatho, which would include Honorius. And then in just a few sessions later, They're condemning him as a heretic, not merely negligent, but as a heretic. Either they're just contradicting themselves, or there should be a way to harmonize these things.
Mhm.
I don't think it's just merely a reversal, like they're changing their mind, because they're not merely just saying, in the case of Honorius in the previous session, they're not merely just saying that, hey, we think that Honorius was free from error, and now we're just changing our mind and we're saying he's a heretic. They're not merely just saying that. They're also saying they agree that the divine promise of Jesus to Peter applies to the successors of Peter in the Bishop of Rome. So they're accepting the ecclesiology.
Yes. Mhm.
So if they are now claiming that Honorius did actually teach in his magisterium heresy, they're going against the ecclesiology they embrace. They're not merely just reversing their decision, they're going against their own ecclesiology, which would be very problematic if they can violate their own ecclesiology. Upon what basis do I trust their Christology? So I don't read them when they condemn Honorius as a heretic as saying that he taught heresy in his magisterium. I have to say, well, clearly they said that he was undefiled. The teaching authority is indefectible. So when they condemn him as a heretic, they're condemning him as a heretic in his private capacity, not in his actual teachings. That's the only way to harmonize it. Otherwise, we just have to say they contradicted themselves, or they rejected their own ecclesiology. They violated their own ecclesiology, which I don't think there's, I don't know. Nobody wins from that, either Catholic or Orthodox.
Yeah, it all goes down. Sure.
It all goes down, and I don't think there's good reason to believe that whenever there's a more simpler solution, and that is they're condemning him as maintaining heresy privately. In other words, what we would consider to be a material heretic, somebody who holds to heresy but unknowingly. They're not intentionally trying to go against a dogma. Like it's not in the will, it's not formal. They're just ignorant that this is heresy. That would be what we would call material heresy. But he's not actually teaching it in his teaching authority. It's just something that he privately holds to. And we as Catholics can believe that a pope could materially be in a state of heresy.
Yeah,
but teaching it is a very different question.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I harmonize the church fathers there, or the council fathers there, is that they're accepting that Honorius was undefiled in his teaching authority, but they're making a judgment about him in his private person.
Yeah.
And by the way, they were even wrong about that, it turns out, because Honorius did not actually hold to monothelitism, which is the heresy he's accused of maintaining. He did not hold to it. So it turns out that they made an error in judgment on that. Now, is it possible for an ecumenical council to err in their evaluation of an individual? Yes. It's one thing to be protected from error on faith and morals. It's another to be protected in your evaluation of an individual. There's no promises of Jesus that a council, an ecumenical council, will be protected from error in their evaluation of an individual. The only promises for an ecumenical council are for their teachings on faith and morals.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So what is when in support of your harmonization, the first thought of somebody who is probably somewhat new to this debate would be, okay, well, what supports that interpretation of the situation, rather than just being, this just being a very contrived maneuver to avoid outright falsification, right? What are sort of independent evidence of the situation we have to think that they're really just talking about this man as a private individual, rather than him binding the church formally, right?
Well, there are some interesting observations that were made in the first millennium. One of the papal librarians actually refers to the case of Honorius, and he says that the council made an error in judgment about Honorius himself. Pope John IV, one of the successors of Pope Honorius, actually wrote an apology for him, showing that he did not maintain the heresy of monothelitism. So did Maximus the Confessor, an Eastern saint, also defended the Pope and showed that. So I think that based on that evidence, we have to rule out the claim that he actually taught heresy, because
they're focused on him as a person in these defenses. Yeah, interesting.
They're focused on him as a person, and they're exonerating him, saying that he did not hold to monothelitism. So if he didn't hold to monothelitism, he certainly would not have taught it.
Mm-hmm.
So in that case, that would then mean that the Council Fathers at Constantinople III made an error in judgment about him and his private person, which they did not consider questions like Pope John IV's apology or even Maximus the Confessor's apology for Pope Honorius. They didn't even evaluate those things. But then you have to ask the question, okay, well, are they just contradicting themselves? Well, I just don't see good reason to say that they're contradicting themselves when they had just previously said that all of Agatho's predecessors had preserved the faith and were unblemished in their teaching authority, and that this teaching authority would be unblemished and undefiled unto the end. There's you just at that point you're forced to either say they're either referring to him in his private person, or we just have to concede they contradicted themselves. Nobody wins there, though.
And yeah, but that's the, at least for the purposes of this, debate. That's not a winning option for anybody to go that. It might be a winning option for like a Protestant, right?
For a Protestant or an atheist, but see, in the context, I'm writing the book specifically for Catholics.
That's right. Yes,
and also by extension, even though they're not the primary audience, but also by extension, Eastern Orthodox. And so it's like, okay, well, among those two groups, I don't have to go beyond that. I think we can both agree that, yeah, that's not an option. Now, if I had written this book to an atheist or something like that, and we're considering the question of Honorius, or Protestants and we're considering the question of Honorius, we would have to go a different direction at that point.
Yeah. You see, for me, like if you just think about like, hey, what would I expect if Catholicism is true versus, if it isn't, right? And I can speak from personal experience to this. Like, if what the church teaches about herself wasn't true, I would expect far more things that seem problematic than there actually have been in the history, and many of them like clearly, like irresolvable. But that's not what you find. You don't find that, right? You find these. Granted, there's several anomalies that you have to kind of think about, right? But I think that there are very plausible harmonizations, reconciliations, whatever, and like, okay, like that's actually pretty impressive. I think when you think about it from that wider, more kind of at least that's the way I would approach it if I'm going outside of just this immediate debate. And then of course I would want to include all the stuff that I think confirms the Catholic faith, everything from the scriptural evidence to Fatima, go right there, and so on. I think it's a huge amount of confirmatory evidence, and right. Granted, every theory has its, and I hasn't called faith a theory, but it's sort of annoying philosopher in me, but it has its anomalies, right?
Yeah.
And granted, right, these were things that I had to seriously consider myself, and even though I'm not an expert, like I always try to look for those like major stress points and see if they actually break something. And when it came to, issues like this, seems like there's actually a range of options, not just like you've given yours, but I remember when I first was thinking about this, it seemed like, there's probably like 2 or 3 different models or ways of thinking about this that shows that this is not a death blow by any means. And then for me, it's kind of as far as I needed to go. If that makes sense, right? Yeah.
And so I'll find difficulties with the Catholic position, but I don't see anything that would falsify it. On the other hand, I don't see any way around this issue for the Eastern Orthodox that doesn't falsify their current claims. About the papacy. They embraced the ecclesiology of Agatho there, even if later on they reversed it. Well, they're now contradicting their own ecclesiology. That doesn't help the Orthodox position. That would, in fact, I think, falsify it. So I don't see how they could recover from this issue, which is why I think it's a deal breaker. Ultimately for Eastern Orthodoxy. And that's what I'm trying to point Catholics to. Look, if you're really concerned about discerning Eastern Orthodoxy, you need to evaluate this, because this council, which the Eastern Orthodox accept, it embraces this ecclesiology. And currently the Eastern Orthodox are opposed to that ecclesiology. And I think that's a death blow to what you would be joining.
Yeah. Excellent. Michael Lofton, thank you so much. Before we say goodbye, please remind us once again of the book. And obviously we've just touched, on one question, one issue, but there's a lot more in there. So what else can people expect to read about?
Yeah, and there's a lot. In fact, I take 30 objections, some of the most common objections that Eastern Orthodox propose, and I engage those. So not just only papacy issues, but also filioque, purgatory, immaculate conception, original sin, liturgical questions, all kinds of stuff. In fact, there's 3 categories: doctrinal. There's a doctrinal section, history section, and then liturgical section. So yeah, it covers the whole scope of what you'll most likely encounter whenever you engage Eastern Orthodox apologists. So all kinds of stuff in there, not just papacy. But yeah, shop.catholic.com, best place to get it.
Grab a copy, and right after that, head over to Reason and Theology, subscribe.
Thank you.
And as always, Michael, a pleasure. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. Are you a Catholic thinking about converting to Eastern Orthodoxy? Or are you a Protestant discerning whether or not to become Catholic or Eastern Orthodox? If so, I have the book just for you. It's called Answering Orthodoxy, and engages all of the arguments that Eastern Orthodox use against the Catholic Church. I respond to all of them. I show that they are in error, and in fact, they're inconsistent, because the things that Orthodox are objecting to are in fact found in their own tradition. So the fullness of the faith can only be found in the Catholic Church. Check out the book right now at shop.catholic.com for